Here today is that I'm working on capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You have heard a lot today about what the problem is. I'm interested in what is the solution to that problem. And I would argue that one of the important things we can do is figure out how to capture carbon dioxide and store it. A little bit inspired the way we go about it by how trees do it. Trees have lots of surface, you call that leaves. And as the wind blows over those surfaces, they slightly absorb CO2. So when we started, we said maybe there are materials which absorb CO2 more aggressively than a leaf surface, but we could spread it out in a way which is not that different from leaves or pine needles. Started to look at real implementations, and we found a plastic material, a resin, which very nicely absorbs CO2. And what we found out, sort of as a bonus, is that if you make it wet, it actually gives the CO2 back. And once we pump the air out, we make it wet, the CO2 will fill the chamber, and then we pump it out of the chamber and compress it all the way to liquid CO2. Now, some of that carbon dioxide we may collect from power plants or other big sources and directly put it away there. There's an advantage to capture things when they're very concentrated. On the other side, nearly half of all emissions come from distributed and small sources, and those we need to deal with too. And there you really have not much choice but to either figure out how to do without those emissions, which means your car better run on electricity or hydrogen. Both of them are quite difficult. Or you have to capture the carbon dioxide after it has been emitted to the atmosphere. In a way, air capture is the method of last resort, because it can capture any CO2 regardless of where it has been made, how it has been made, and where it is emitted into the air, and for that matter when. You could imagine having a car which over its lifetime will put out 100 tons of CO2, and before you even buy that car, you put 100 tons of CO2 away. So in a sense, you create a hole into which you can put that CO2 over the course of the next 10, 12 years. Do that, and you collect carbon dioxide as the air just blows over it, you can convince yourself that that part of the collecting apparatus is actually not that expensive. The expensive part is that now that the CO2 is absorbed on these surfaces, on that material, you have to pry it loose again, you have to get it off. And that will cost you money and energy. And so what we looked at is how much is that going to be. What we found sort of on theoretical grounds is it has to be more than scrubbing a flue stack of a power plant, because you can use a slightly weaker sorbent, but it doesn't have to be much stronger to collect from the air. So the overall, the binding energy required is not prohibitively large. And time to do something about the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. In pre-industrial times, it was about 280 parts per million. It now has reached 385. It is going up at 2 parts per million. If you count all the other greenhouse gases we have added, people call this the parts per million equivalent. They are throwing in things like methane and chlorofluorocarbons, things we introduce into the atmosphere which also have greenhouse gas impact. And if you add all of those up, we are already well above 400, we are near 430. Now, the Europeans feel that the 2-degree temperature change, which might be the limit as far as one could go, that will be reached at 450 parts per million. So if I take the equivalent, if I count it all, I'm only 20 parts per million away, which means we will close that gap in essentially 10 years, because we are going up more than 2 parts per million a year right now. So that's a very serious challenge, and we need to figure out how to stop soon. And practically speaking, the inertia in a modern energy infrastructure is so large that I think it's not realistic to believe that we will actually make that target. Right? If some other if the optimists are right and say we can go to 550 parts per million. I still think it requires a heroic effort to stop there.